you're here today. Hope you're doing well. I'm having a trachea right now, so hope it doesn't bother anyone. Today, I wanted to make a video about fairies. And the reason why is that the fairy theme, everything been really coming up to me. And I already feel like the fairies is something needed, is a topic that wants to be talked about. Okay? Whether you believe in fairies or you don't, doesn't matter. Better to keep an open mind or listen to it for enjoyment and entertainment. So I discovered that there is this website that is for fairies. And I will be reading from it. And guys, any name that I cannot pronounce, I apologize in advance. However, I think from pre-reading, like reading in general about fairies, I think they really mostly commonly heard from Europe. The Greeks mentioned it. It's pretty much in the Celtic culture or mythology. But do you have to be from this area to believe in it? I don't think so. And I feel like at one point everything just converged. So I'm going to be reading from this website called Fairiest. Okay, the Fairiest website have a menu. The first thing on the menu is fairy questions. Okay, they have a menu. And they have something on top of the menu. Their message is Fairy Investigation Society. Okay, fairy questions is the first thing. Books on fairies second. Fairy types, fairy places, fairy sighting, fairy beliefs, fairy tales, fairy pictures, fairy movies, fairies and children, fairy ornaments, fairy links, and things I don't know. We're gonna read through this interesting website. And guys, if you're so young that you only grew up on iPads, apps, maybe don't know much about websites, but websites are just an old way of researching and doing things, I guess. Maybe most of you guys know. I don't know. I think no kid is interested in websites anymore, including myself. I'm not the biggest fan. You know, we opt for books or videos to guide us now, I think, more than looking into a website, except if we learn that this certain website would pique our interest. Many people use website sites like Portfolio right now. Okay, so the first question is, are fairies aliens? Is fairy and an alien the same thing? The first response to this question is obviously not. The first comes from a hole in the ground, the other from a hole in the sky. But think about it for a moment. 1. Fairies and aliens are both usually described as non-human humanoids, sometimes with pointed ears. 2nd, fairies and aliens are often associated with bright lights. 3rd, fairies and aliens need humanity for reasons that are not clear. In either case, they constantly interact with Homo sapiens. 5. Or 4. Fairies and aliens both kidnap humans. 5. Fairies and aliens are unpredictable in their behavior. They're neither entirely good nor entirely evil, though they often show that they have anger management issues. Maybe we do have anger suppression, guys, and the fairies just know how to do it. Who knows? Okay, we finished the points. Then, fairy belief trailed off over most of the Western world in the 19th century, and by the 20th century, belief in UFOs and greys and numerous other fantastical creatures from beyond took their place. Before there were aliens, there were mysterious airships, and antennae in the sky. I'm not sure about this one. It is almost as if a vacuum was left by the disappearance of fairies, and that green humanoids from other planets took over the franchise. This is by no means an original theory, and was already playing around with the folklore significance of UFO in the 1958. Then, in 1969, Jake Vallée published Passport to Magonia, where the French scholar looked at the curious parallels between aliens and fairies. Most subsequent work, not least by Vallée himself, has pushed down the same tracks. Example, Roger Wax, I don't know who's that, can't pronounce his name, 1991, with the idea that whether or not various aliens exist, they represent essentially the same set of experience and human needs. Of course, it could be argued that all supernatural creatures tend to fulfill the same roles, be they fairies or aliens or the Virgin Mary. Still, the parallels are there, and they're striking. I definitely would want to hear what you guys think. I'm not really in love with the answer that they've given us. You know what, in my opinion, we can't think of them certain things with totally logical thinking. Okay. And even in reality, in our what we call reality, things feels like a dream. I don't know, that's what I think. So, I do think fairies exist. I think it's a collective thinking. If we want to see them, maybe we should actually every day think about them, to acknowledge their presence. I don't know. Are fairies real? Perhaps the only sensible answer to this question is, what do you mean by fairies? After all, we define fairies as little humanoids the size of butterflies with gossamer wings. Gossamer wings? Who help hedgehogs and children and never lose their temper? The answer will be no. Fairies do not exist. If you define fairies as a series of phenomena experienced by certain individuals, then even the most hardened skeptic must answer yes. After all, some individuals clearly have unaccountable experiences that need to be explained, even if we decide that they're happening in, not outside their heads. But do fairies exist outside of our heads? Or are they just a product of abnormal special brains? The fact that fairies are typically seen by children at night, alone, or while the witness is in bed should all set off warning clankingly loud bells. But as the skeptic has an easy time of it, let's instead concentrate on 4 reasons for taking fairy sighting seriously as an external reality. First, the great number of fairy sightings. It is true that fewer people see fairies today than did in the past, but even in the materialistically inclined urban 21st century, the number of sightings of supernatural but living humanoids, our definition of fairies, is surprisingly high. It is not just a question then of explaining away 3 or 4 weirdos. Second, the type of witnesses. Many witnesses are men and women who might be said to be physically inclined. That is to say that, whether psychic phenomenon exists or not, these individuals believe that they are privy to special insights and even visions. It would not be particularly surprising were a medium, say, or a psychic to see a fairy. But on the other occasions, we have sighting from individuals who declare themselves to be skeptics, but whose minds have been changed by something that they cannot account for. Third, the consistency of fairy sightings. Themes repeat themselves in fairy sightings. Fairies often do the same things when seen by witnesses, even witnesses who don't apparently know much about fairy lore. For example, fairies again and again are seen dancing in circles, even when those who see the fairies knew nothing, or claim to know nothing about dancing fairies. Of course, it could be that fairies dance because of some psychological stimuli buried down within us, and the psychological stimuli works in the same way in different individual. If so, neither skeptics nor believers have come though close to explaining the fairy dancing stimulus. Fourth, fairies like particular places. It is not clear why, but fairies tend to appear in the same location, in the same way that ghosts are often associated with the same room or the same corridor. Why does this suggest that the authenticity of fairy sightings? Quite simply because some individuals who see fairies are not aware that fairies were associated with the place where they had their fairy experience. No self-respecting skeptic will have had their faith shaken too much by this little list. For one, there is simply not the raw data to lead to any conclusions. However, let's just keep the door open to believe. If fairies do exist, how can we possibly explain them? There have been various attempts to do so over the years. is no question that the most popular modern explanation is that fairies are nature spirits. That is to say, now when we see fairies, we are actually seeing spirits of nature processes, be that a tree growing, a fire burning, a rock being David Boyle, for example, suggests that fairies might be some hidden aspect of natural processes. The personification of the personification of frowning or photosynthesis. Say it has to be said that fairy lore includes very little of this. Here we have a late 19th century reinterpretation of fairy lore at the hands of theosophists. Of course, that does not mean that is it not true. Another approach that tries to break the gap between belief and disbelief claims that fairies are the personifications of natural and other processes that through human passions take on an actual external reality and become independent of the mental processes that created them. There is no question that belief, though, in any external reality for fairy is anti-scientific, at least anti the science we have now at hand. Whether that is a good thing or not is another question. I definitely have the comment section for you guys to share what do you think. For me, I think if we neglect our ability to see and feel because science is only associated with a ruler and other scientific tools, we're missing out pretty much. I think there are other things in the world that we're not there to really study them or see them. They're kind of associated with beyond our perception before because they are difficult to study or observe, maybe that's why we call them beyond, but we don't deny their existence. I don't know, what do you think? That's just what I think. It just scares us that we might not know something, right? And it's natural human nature. Okay. The fourth question is, are fairies small? Time and time again, reference guides refer to fairies as being diminutive or tiny. In some cases, microscopic would be a better word. Shakespeare refers in Romeo and Juliet to Queen Mab riding over a man nose with her horses, in shape not bigger than an agate stone on the forefinger of an older man, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep among the trooping or social fairies. This is sometimes, though by no means always the case. However, when we turn instead to the solitary or antisocial fairies, they are rarely tiny. In fact, sometimes they are significantly bigger than any human they might happen to bump into, and their size is one of the most intimidating things about them. The best examples here are sinister humanoids like trolls, or some of the adventure, Hogwarts, I don't know. It is even possible that some traditional giants should be classified as OG or OG fairies. Excuse me, I don't have the dictionary for these things to pronounce it right. Oh Lord, there are many questions. Okay, the question now is, do fairies have pointed ears? Time and time again in illustrations, fairies are shown to have pointed ears, and this dates back to the early modern woodcuts when fairies are first made into works of art. Take, for example, the small image of Robin Goodfellow below, which almost certainly dates to the late 16th century. Yeah, I'm gonna probably share the link of this website and you guys could do your own reading and investigation on looking at these pictures. Maybe you need to see the picture, I don't know. Where does this notion of pointy-eared fairies come from? There are two related answers to the question. The first is that in antiquity, centuries, and most importantly, Pan, were shown as part animals, and as such, they often have pointed ass or donkey ears. The image is from the 4th century BC. Guys, you have to look at them. Weird enough, they kind of look demon-like. The second is that the rise of Christianity and the death of the pagan world, Pan and his fraternity were quite literally demonized. Demons in medieval art were portrayed as having pointed animal ears that went together perfectly with the cloven goat hoof of the devil. Yes, as you can see, I immediately thought that they were demon-like. There is a reason. The fact, then, that fairies are shown with pointed ears is hardly a compliment, at least it wasn't in the 16th century, when any Christian would understand the implication all too well. But by the 19th century, pointy ears were just part of fairy uniform, though many more realistic artists avoided the touch. In the 20th century, Tolkien did not perhaps have a clear idea about elves' ears in the Middle Earth, but cartoons and films of his universe left at the chance of a cheap and useful symbol of difference. Then there's Spock, a science fiction elf, and by now, pointed ears for a fantasy or off-world creature is almost a reflex. And perhaps most curiously, what would Pan, St. Augustine, or for that matter Tolkien have had to say about this ear sculpting? Okay, I'm gonna read another question, which is a beautiful question. Do fairies have wings? If you watch a Disney cartoon with fairies or Felk through random images of fairies on Google's image search, fairies have one thing in common: wings. However, traditional accounts do not describe fairies' wings, though fairies can fly or at least rush from place to place in a moment. Where then do wings come from? A crucial moment come in Pope Rob of the Loch, 1712, one of the most important 18th century English poems, where A.P. writes the following lines. Some to the sun their insect wings unfold, waft on the breeze, or sink in the clouds of gold, transparent forms too fine for mortal sight. It would be interesting to know where on earth Bob got this line from. These words, in any case, just stated in Thomas Stothard Pope's late 18th century illustrator, showed fairies to have butterfly wings on the basis of this line in 1798. Though in fact the fairies resemble far more the new-seeding Italian potiche chirps of the late Renaissance than they do English fairies, as they had been imagined in the previous centuries. However, there may have been something more general in the air, for already in the 1790 Fuseli book showed fairies with bats' wings. Why do we have to wait to the end of the 18th century for this? One possibility is that fairies were increasingly accepted and they were being assimilated to Renaissance chirps. As the Renaissance was beginning to take off in the English-speaking world, another possibility is that as fairies declined in popular culture, they were gentrified and became more and more like angels. In any case, the idea shot quickly through our culture to the point where the most recent fairy cartoon, Tinker Bell and the Wings, an entire film is based around the question of flight, and there is now a small industry of fairy wings producers. However, knowing authors and artists have understood that wings are surplus to requirement. Susan Townsend Warner, for example, in her Kingdoms of Elephant, claims that it is not seen as properly fairy to fly, and that only commoners would take out their wings. She may have a point, and her fairies don't blink at playing golf, but the wings will out. 20th century fairy sighting often describe beings with wings, something that would never have happened in the 19th century. Let's read another question. Okay, there are many questions. I don't know if I should read all the questions. They're not bad questions, but sometimes I wonder. Okay, I'm gonna read all of the questions. Now, the question: do fairy tales have fairies? If you buy a book of fairy tales, you might expect to get a book full of fairies. But of course, any child who has sat at his parents' knee to listen to a story knows that fairy tales rarely have fairies in them. The fairy and fairy tales come from a now obscure French work entitled Contes de Rony, I don't know, I'm sorry. But actually, fairies were not particularly common in this work either. Perhaps the best way to think of a fairy tale is to give fairy the now absolute, not once common sense of, as the Oxford English Dictionary puts it, enchantment magic, a magic contrivance, an illusion, a dream. Cinderella is a magic story. Snow White is a tale of enchantment. Perhaps the closest word in modern English, though it is on its way out, is fancy. Goldilocks has fancy tale, or better still, a fancy so much nicer than the ugly German beloved by vulgarists. Okay, I apologize for my pronunciation because I don't know how to pronounce these names. I just have to say it again, and I'm reading something unexpected, I'm like you guys, reading all of this for the first time. I think it's better to read it for the first time for an ASMR video, because if I would read it again, I might lose my mind. I don't like reading things twice, especially within the same day, and you guys just understand it. Thank you. In case that's the linguistics of fairy tale, what about those rare fairies? Cinderella has a fairy godmother. Rompelest would be, in the English tradition, solitary fairy. There is an Italian tale, The Three Fairies. Though this has never had much success in English-speaking world, Peter Pan is sometimes dropped into fairy book collections for the young, though it is 20th century novel that became a famous play in 1904. Very occasionally, this was truer in Victorian and Edwardian times. Shakespeare, Midsummer Night's Dream was also included in fairy tale collections, though there is lots of fancy but not much tale. Not particularly satisfying from the point of view of a 6 years old. But hold on a second, what actually went wrong? Britain and Ireland had an extraordinary range of traditional stories, many of which included fairies, yet these stories did not appear in the most 19th century's collections, and they were quite forgotten by the 20th century. These tales, the true fairy tales of the English-speaking world, are often less polished and cruder than Hans Christian Andersen, but they remain entertaining for young and old alike. In fact, their very crudity is the guarantee that they are closer to the traditions that they were slowly sanded down in the great French, German, and later Scandinavian collections. Actually, guys, I wanted to read about fairies before coming to this website or searching it, and I definitely did go on Reddit, and I've seen people to ask about where they can read more about fairies, and somebody recommended a book. It seems like it's one of those old books, so it's gonna be difficult for me to understand in general. And it turned out it's an Irish book, so yes, I read a bit and still really puzzled. But let's continue on. How do I meet a fairy? There are literally hundreds of records from the last 500 years where individuals claim to have seen fairies, have talked to fairies, have killed fairies, have slept with fairies, and in some cases have, they say, gone to live fairies and raise children with them. According to traditions, these associations rarely end well. Perhaps then the question should be, how do I avoid fairies? However, as you have clicked on this link, you deserve a proper answer to a dangerous question. The first rule for seeing fairies is the children rule. When we collate fairy sightings, a striking number involve children who are younger than 10. Likewise, many people who claim that they saw fairies when they were children also claim that they saw fairies less and less. Lots in infancy, a few in their adolescence, and then rarely, if ever, by the time that they reach adulthood. The second rule for seeing fairies is the bed rule. Again, a striking number of fairy sightings, like ghost sightings and other visions, take place in bed, either before bed, during, or immediately after sleep. For obvious reasons, there is the suspicion here that the sighting is connected with some sort of dream state. The third rule for seeing fairies is the night rule. Even if you're not in bed, more fairies and supernatural creatures are seen at night. Believers explain this with reference to fairy tradition that claims that fairies prefer the night. Skeptics point to the excess of shadows and the possibility of confusing small visual stimuli at midnight. The fourth rule for seeing fairies is the repetition rule. And an unusual number of sightings involve individuals undertaking some kind of repetitive agricultural work. Example, honing a field or picking blackberries. Again, there is suspicion that there is some kind of a mental state that either brings down the certain between the curtain between our and another dimension, the believer, or creates the necessary conditions for some kind of illusion, the skeptic. The fifth rule is the country rule. Fairies are seen in cities, but even there, fairies tend to be seen in parks and gardens. It's much more common for fairies to be seen in the countryside, in the fields and woods, or on the moors than in an urban setting. Is this because fairies prefer the countryside, or because the country creates a particular state of mind? The sixth rule is the habit rule. Fairies are traditionally seen in certain places on that hill rather than on this hill. For example, if you're a fairy believer, you will conclude that this is because fairies live in the fairy hill, or plain or wood, and question if, on the other hand, you're a skeptic, you will deduce that certain places create conditions conducive to optical illusions or special psychological states. The seventh rule, the lone rule. Fairies are rarely seen by groups of people, though there are few fascinating cases. They are typically seen by individuals on their own. The eighth rule, as with other supernatural visions, those who see fairies may be under stress, or they may be worried, or they may have recently suffered a tragedy. Summing up, then, the ideal circumstances for seeing a fairy would be to send an emotionally disturbed 10-year-old blackberrying at dust on a hill associated with fairies on his or her own. If that doesn't sound like good parenting, then we return to the point that perhaps meeting fairies is not safest activity. Okay, I think fairies, for me, my opinion, would show themselves to whom they need to be seeing them. How many different types of fairies are there? Okay, coffee break. Truth to be told, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of fairies. A number of reference works have attempted the thankless task of cataloging different fairy types, but it is, make no mistake, hopeless. Every region had its own fairy type, and even names are misleading. Just because pixie meant one thing in Devon does not mean that pixie meant the same thing in Cornwall. Likewise, fairies with different names in different areas sometimes sound suspiciously similar. For example, the brownie of Lowland, Scotland, the Dobie of northern England often appear in tales in the same role and with the same temperament. However, there is a way through all this confusion. Fairy tale theorists have long noticed that fairies tend to break down into two categories: trooping and solitary fairies, whereas they have also been called social and antisocial fairies. Trooping or social fairies are hives animals. They live in groups and are seen in groups at drills or dancing or even funerals. These are the conventional fairies of the Western imagination. Of trooping social fairies are bees and solitary or antisocial fairies are dragon, flies, or stag beetle. They tend to be seen on their own. In this category, there are leprechauns, bogarts, and silkies. There are kind of questions that I don't think I would want to read because there's this question now that I'm going to be reading. How should I behave among fairies? If we see a fairies, let's say, I don't know if we would be able to comprehend and remember any of that. It's going to be natural because I think fairies are connected to the immediate experience. To bring that into the fairies can be a little wild, okay? How should I behave among fairies? It is beautiful, cool evening. You're walking along the way when you hear the peculiar jangling of fairy music, and you turn to see, to your amazement, a group of 20 fairies dancing in a circle around a large toadstool. What do you do? Well, it used to be said that it was bad luck to see the fairies before they saw you. As extremely private creatures, they resent being spied upon and do not hesitate to punish those who were nosy about their world. Not for nothing they are called the secret people, and in fairy curiosity really does kill the cat. And in fairy curiosity really does kill the cat. You should probably then take a deep breath, enjoy the sight, and walk quickly on. Of course, fairies may take it upon themselves to come into your life and your house. Even then, though, their desire for secrecy remains. For example, fairies used to give money to their favorites, but if the lucky recipient was foolish enough to mouth the fairies' generosity around, they would stop their dole payments. Some fairies, particularly brownies, are so generous with their time that they actually help around the house. However, again, they would only do work once the household had gone to sleep, and they were furious if it transpired that human eyes had been upon them without their permission. Fairies are also sensitive about things that might seem obvious because they are courtesies that would extend to any human being. For example, if you leave fairies food or drink, make sure that the water is clean and the food is wholesome. Little stale bread will not cause offense. Cheese crawling with maggots will bring the wrath of the fae upon you. Fairies like things to be clean as well. Pixies were sometimes credited with pinching housewives who left the kitchen in a shameful state. They also particularly resented rubbish being thrown on their heads. In days gone by, when slobs were disposed out of the window at night, this was a real danger. Traditional storytellers had one great concern: that fairies would capture or take individuals away with them. If that should happen, then the individual in question faced a stark choice. If he or she played by the fairies' rules, then they would be their prisoner for a time or perhaps forever. If instead they followed the rules below, then they might get home by morning. First, a fairy prisoner should never dance with a fairy. W.B. Yeats records one poor man who made that mistake and returned home a year later without any toes. I think this is the guy that I read his book, but I'm not sure. She danced them off. The image below comes instead from the 19th century Wales. I'm gonna make sure if it's the guy that I'm reading his book, I'm gonna continue on reading in that. Yeah, this is the man that I'm reading his book. Okay, let's continue on. Second, don't ever take food or drink from the fairies, and that includes fruit hanging from their trees and water running in their streams. As with all supernatural creatures, the act of drinking or eating their food means that you become their prisoner. If a cup of wine is pushed in your direction, follow the sensible advice of the best fairy book heroes and pretend to drink it, dropping it down your front instead. Third, don't get romantically involved with a fairy. Tradition claims that fairies deliberately brought humans into their realms who they wanted to seduce or marry. These relationships never ended well, and the kids need lots of counseling. Tempting. Okay. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 questions left, and the website has more than these questions. This website is really amazing. I don't know if I should do a part 2 continuing exploring this website together. I would love to do so because I'm in a very kink, I don't know, not a kink. I'm just into fairies right now, okay? The seventh question is weird, it's not even answered, so we only have 6 questions. What are fairy names like? Shakespeare gives us some beautiful, cute names. In Midsummer Night's Dream, Peas, Blossom, Cobweb, Moth, Mustard Seed, and even the classical sounding Titania. However, the one fairy name that we know predates Shakespeare from the Dream book, Buke, is of a rather different type. It is short, muscular, and a little bit menacing. Later, fairy names range from the aristocratic. There was a nasty Bogart called Annabelle in the South Pennines, who lived in a barn, to the vivid red cap and the borders to the hickish sounding in the 19th century southern Cornwall, wearied of a fairy child called Coleman Gray, to the aristocratic Queen Mab in Romeo and Juliet, to the botanical old Queen Moss in Greenfield, Siddleworth, to the diminutive Wee Willie Winky from the Scottish nursery rhyme, to the petrifying Bloody Bones. Modern fairy fiction has tended to build on this rich and varied tradition. Sookie Stackhouse, for example, for the HBO series True Blood sounds just right. Peter Pan's guardian Tinkerbell could have appeared in Midsummer Night's Dream. She had. What is this? Okay, I wish I never read this question. I'm sorry, because it's super not making sense to me. So I'm gonna only read one because I feel like I'm gonna omit the other questions. Okay, I'm gonna read, what is fairy spirituality? I think I know this lady, I don't know. Okay, that's a long one. Probably the best one so far. Fairy spirituality would have been a very strange concept to the rural Scots, the Welsh and Irish men and women who believed in fairies in the 18th and 19th century. Their main concern was placating the fairies and in a very few cases of using fairies to work good or evil in the world. However, modern perceptions of fairies began to change with spiritualism in the second half of the 19th century. Spiritualism was all about sitting around a table and contacting the dead, and by the 1890s, it was a major social movement, often referred to as the New Age of its day. Early spiritualist writers tried to explain fairies, believing that fairies were in fact elemental spirits, the power behind the workings of nature. In doing this, they were aping various ancient and above all Renaissance philosophers who had come to similar conclusions. I think they have this picture of, I'm not sure what her name is, Madame Blavatsky. I'm not sure if it's her. Fairies were never that important for spiritualists. However, a branch of spiritualism, theosophy, under the leadership of the legendary and rather frightening Madame Blavatsky picture, was inclined to look upon fairies as a vital part of any understanding of the natural world. In fact, read theosophy books or articles, and you will constantly trip over fairy references. Today, we forget just how influential theosophy was in forming modern views of fairies. For example, Evans Wentz had clear theosophist sympathies, as did several of his informants in his fairy faith in Celtic countries. Likewise, the Cottingley photographs, the most famous fairy photographs and fakes ever taken, first came to light at a theosophist meeting, the Fairy Investigation Society, founded in the 1926, had a clear theosophist agenda. Theosophy codified fairies and also explained exactly how they help natural processes along, and these ideas for good and for bad have affected how we depict fairies. For example, Disney Tinkerbell cartoons have theosophist philosophy in several scenes, though their markers will have been completely unaware of this. For anyone interested in reading vivid theosophist accounts, 3 authors stand out. First, there is Geoffrey Hudson, who published several books including fairy sightings, but most interesting fairies at work and play, with a visit to Cottingley in 1922. Second, there is Daphne Carter Fairy Vision that have now been edited into a beautiful volume by R.J. Stewart Books. We include her channeled account of a fairy party elsewhere on the site. Then finally, there is Dora Van Gelder, whose The Real World of Fairies includes perhaps the most coherent account of theosophy and fairies. For a description of a standard New England fairy, and for an insight into how theosophists thought of fairies, follow this link. Okay, they are adding a link. Theosophy may not be taken seriously by many people today, but writers like Charters, Hudson, and Van Gelder were the closest we have to continuing fairy tradition through the middle decades of the 20th century. Were they really any different from the tradition bearers of the 18th and 19th centuries? Yes and no. Okay, I'm gonna stop and just drink some coffee. Thank you for waiting. This one is a long one. Fairies had a certain mystical catches in the late 18,000 and the early 19,000s. The poet W.B. Yeats, for example, this is the guy I'm reading his book, could boast of his fairy belief at swish London parties. However, by the time of the Cottingley fairies were already becoming less fashionable. By the 1950s and the UFO craze, interest in fairies dropped to historically low levels. The Fairy Investigation Society, for example, found that although reports of unidentified flying object received tolerant public notice, reports of fairy sighting encouraged press ridicule. However, interest began to grow again in the 1960s and the 1970s when two new trends helped to bring fairies belief back from the brink. First, there was increased interest in regional British and Irish traditions and in other countries in native traditions. Then second, there was what might be very broadly called the hippie movement. Hippies, with their interest in ecological and spiritual matters, found the theosophical vision of fairies to be attractive, though most of those who became fairy believers had no idea that they were adopting theosophist ideas. Indeed, most would have had no idea what theosophy was. In modern times, fairy spirituality has broken down into 5 distinct, if overlapping traditions. We have capitalized for the sake of clarity. First, there is fairy magic. Second, fairy Wicca. Third, Celtic fairy shamanism. Fourth, the fairy tradition. And the fifth, the fairy folk. For those outside the magic fairy circle, the difference between these 5 tendencies can be utterly bewildering, and the profusion of fairies and related words is a strange occult version of numerous socialists and communist sects on the fringe of the student movements in the 1860s. But as these differences matter to practitioners, they should matter to anyone interested in fairy lore and fairy traditions generally. This starts with fairy magic. Note the use of fairy as opposed to fairy. I don't know how to read this. Fairy magic? That has since the early 20th century been used to signal knowing attitude, let's say, to fairies. Fairy magic is perhaps the latest of the 5 forms here. Fairy magic involves a person's relation with fairies to achieve change in the world. In terms of psychology, health, and well-being, many fairy magic magicians make the point that the existence of fairies is besides the point. Non-believers interacting and hopefully individuating features of his or her own personality by communicating with fairies. Okay. Fairy Wicca refers to a branch of the Wicca religion. Wicca is, of course, a modern of paganism that claims to have its root in the rural traditions of Britain and Ireland, though many contest the supposed historical biases of this tradition, not least some of the most interesting. Because fairy Wicca was pioneered above all by Kisma Stepanich in the mid-1990s. Wicca writer who was interested particularly in Irish traditions about fairies and who believed that this tradition could be recovered and formed into a spiritual discipline. It is very difficult to generalize, but fairy Wiccan's emphasis not only in relation with fairies of various types, but also a more visceral attitude to nature and a greater attention to the passing of the seasons than mainstream Wiccans. Celtic fairy shamanism takes a shamanic approach, using the fairies as familiars on the road to spiritual development, and the fairies, I don't know how to say it. Fairies are begin with occupy another world. Fairies are beings which occupy another world or dimension that lies close to our own. These are often called the Shining Ones or the Shining People. They are able to interact with humankind, and contact between the fairies and humans was quite common before the advent of Christianity in the Celtic countries. The fairies still exist in the in the bright realms that lie all around ours. Celtic shamanism are able to enter those realms and interact with the Shining Ones. Emma Wilby's work on modern witchcraft may suggest that Celtic fiery shamans are attempting to revivify a long dead but historically attested tradition. The FERI tradition was associated above all with two mystics, Cora and Victor Anderson. Of this list of modern fairy traditions, it is certainly the wildest, including sexual mysticism and ecstatic religious ceremonies. Fairy lore is important but not central, with tantric, Hona, and even Buddha rites and wisdom being mixed in. The Andersons have now both died. Cora passed in 2008, and the FERI tradition is reforming around new personalities. There has been a reversion to fiery among some practitioners, so watch out for even greater confusion in the future. The fairy folk are a small, largely Irish tradition detailed by Dennis Gavin in his Running with Fairies DG. Includes long passages where the fairy folk talk about their beliefs. A central idea is that the fairy folk are themselves fairies who have been born back into human form. Fairy folk claim to be best in tune with their fairy brethren in the wildest, away from cities and urban centuries. Okay, I'm gonna stop reading from the website. I noticed I'm reading faster, and it's not relaxing to deliver information. I don't even know towards the end if I'm pronouncing things right. I've been interested in fairies for so many reasons, especially these months. They say do not talk about fairies, but I'm talking about them. It's interesting. Anyways, I'm tired. I can barely talk. Let me know if you want to continue more on fairies. I'm not claiming that I'm a scientist. I'm just here reading with you all. And if you have anything different than fairies, any myth or whatever people call it, a creature of some kind, let's read it. I do believe that there are elemental beings that are beyond our vision, and I do like Theosophy because they do mention Theosophy, and I kind of like Theosophy. It's so interesting. Anyways, I'm sending you all an amazing, incredible fairy. I'm sending you all so much goodness and love. Thank you all for watching, and if you want to support me, which I would appreciate so much, you can find the link down below to donate. And